I don't care what your little piece of paper says. You do not belong in this cabin. Darla Whitmore adjusted her oversized sunglasses and thrust her stiletto-clad legs straight into the aisle, her glittering dress catching the overhead lights. She leaned back into the plush leather of the stolen seat, treating her outstretched legs like a physical barricade. Behind her, business executives in sharp suits paused, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. A flight attendant froze in the galley, paralyzed by the sudden tension. "Are you deaf?" Darla's voice pitched higher, performing for her captive audience. "I said move. Someone get security and drag this intruder out of here right now." Evan Cole remained perfectly still. Dressed in a simple dark hoodie, he just looked down at his boarding pass with a calm, deeply unbothered expression. He let her narrate her imaginary victimhood, absorbing her insults in total silence. Darla felt like she was winning, but she had no idea she was currently screaming at the multi-billion-dollar tech CEO who had recently become the majority shareholder of her husband's consulting firm. She didn't know the man in the hoodie was seconds away from terminating their $500 million contract before the plane even took off. Before we get to this epic, empire-crushing takedown, drop a comment below with where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is one you absolutely can't miss.
The gate agent had already made her final boarding announcement when Evan Cole stepped onto the jetway, his phone still pressed to his ear, his voice low and unhurried. He wasn't rushing. He never rushed. There was something in the way he moved through crowded spaces, a kind of quiet displacement, like water finding its level, that made people step aside without knowing exactly why they'd done it. He ended the call as he crossed the threshold into the cabin, tucking the phone into the front pocket of his dark hoodie. Around him, the first-class passengers had already settled into the ceremony of departure, folded jackets, accepted champagne flutes, the careful choreography of people who considered luxury their natural habitat. Evan noticed none of it, or rather, he noticed all of it and found nothing worth remarking on. He'd been in enough of these cabins to know that the seats were just seats. He checked his boarding pass once, more out of habit than necessity. Seat 2A, window. He preferred the window. The problem became apparent from several rows away. A woman had arranged herself across the seat with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in her life been told no and meant it. She was somewhere in her late 40s, dressed in a way that demanded acknowledgement, a sequined cocktail dress catching every photon of the overhead lighting, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, despite the fact that they were indoors and it was 9 o'clock at night. Her legs were extended straight out into the aisle, crossed at the ankle, heels glinting. Beside her, taking up what would have been a lap, sat an enormous designer handbag, structured leather, gold hardware, the kind of object that has its own publicist. The seat she occupied was 2A. Evan stopped at the row. He looked at the seat. He looked at the woman in the seat. He looked back down at his boarding pass with the same expression a man might wear while reading a mildly interesting weather report. "Excuse me," he said, not loudly, not with any particular sharpness, just the two words placed gently into the air between them. Darla Whitmore did not look up. She was scrolling through her phone with the focused energy of someone conducting important business, though what she was actually doing was watching a video of a Maltese puppy on a paddleboard. She let the silence stretch for a beat, a calculated beat, the kind that communicates hierarchy, before slowly, deliberately lowering her sunglasses to the bridge of her nose and angling her gaze upward. She took him in, the hoodie, the plain dark canvas sneakers, the carry-on that, while clearly expensive, was not the right brand for this cabin. No watch visible, no obvious insignia of belonging. She made her assessment in approximately 2 seconds, and her assessment was wrong in every meaningful way, but she had no mechanism available to her in that moment to understand that. "Can I help you?" she said, in the tone of someone who has no intention of helping anyone. "This is my seat," he said. He held up the boarding pass, angled it toward her briefly, then lowered it. He didn't need her to examine it. He wasn't asking for her opinion on its validity. He was stating a fact, the way you state the time of day. Darla's chin lifted. Something shifted in her posture, a subtle stiffening, a gathering of theatrical energy. The people in the surrounding seats were paying attention now. A man in a charcoal suit across the aisle had lowered his Financial Times. A woman 2 rows back had stopped applying her lipstick. The flight attendant at the front of the cabin, a young man named Derek, who had been in the job for 3 years and thought he had seen everything, felt his hand tighten slightly around the handle of the galley drawer he had been about to open. "I don't care what your little piece of paper says," Darla said, and her voice had found its performance register now, that particular pitch that was simultaneously speaking to Evan and to everyone else within earshot. Evan said nothing. He stood in the aisle with his bag in his hand and looked at her with an expression that was not angry, not embarrassed, not uncertain. It was the expression of a man waiting for a delayed elevator, mildly inconvenienced, entirely unimpressed, prepared to wait as long as necessary. This was the thing about Darla Whitmore. She was fluent in the language of social pressure. She knew how to use silence against people, how to make them fidget and apologize and retreat. She had spent decades curating a life in which her discomfort was the most important discomfort in any room. But Evan Cole's stillness was not the stillness of someone absorbing a blow. It was the stillness of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome of this interaction and found none of them particularly interesting. He adjusted the strap of his bag. He glanced toward Derek in the galley, not in appeal, just in acknowledgement, a brief, even look that communicated something Derek could not quite name, but which made him straighten up instinctively. Then he looked back at Darla, patient, unbothered, occupying his corner of the universe with the quiet, immovable certainty of a man who has never once needed anyone else to confirm that he belonged somewhere. He simply waited, and somewhere in the circuitry of Darla's instincts, below the performance and the sunglasses and the weaponized entitlement, something small and uncertain flickered briefly to life, the faintest suggestion that she had perhaps miscalculated. She ignored it, as she always ignored such things. She pressed her heels further into the aisle carpet, raised her chin another degree, and prepared to escalate.
Darla's escalation was swift and total, the way a summer storm announces itself not with a single raindrop, but with an immediate, violent downpour. "Are you deaf?" Her voice pitched upward, sharp enough to slice through the ambient hum of the cabin systems, the polite murmur of settling passengers, the distant clinking of ice in glasses further back in the plane. "I said move! Someone get security and drag this intruder out of here right now!" The cabin went still in that particular way that only happens when strangers collectively decide to stop pretending they aren't watching something. The man with the Financial Times had given up entirely on the pretense of reading. The woman with the lipstick had turned fully in her seat. Even the low, mechanical breathing of the ventilation system seemed to pause. Derek, the flight attendant, stepped out of the galley. He was 26 years old and had a natural instinct for de-escalation that his supervisor had noted twice in his performance reviews, but he could feel it straining against the sheer atmospheric pressure of Darla's performance. "Ma'am," he began, moving toward the row with practiced calm. Darla cut him off without looking at him. "Don't ma'am me. I want to know why this person thinks he can walk onto my flight and demand my seat. I am a Platinum Elite member. Do you have any idea how many miles I fly in a year?" She paused, not for anyone to answer, but for effect. "My husband's firm spent $400,000 with this airline last quarter alone." Evan had not moved. He had not shifted his weight, not exhaled audibly, not done anything that could be read as a reaction. He stood in the aisle with his bag at his side and watched Darla perform with the detached patience of a man who had sat through longer and more sophisticated presentations than this one. Darla turned to the cabin at large, rotating in her stolen seat to address her audience directly. The sunglasses were back up, fully deployed. "Is anyone else seeing this? He just walked up and started harassing me. I was sitting here, minding my own business, and he started demanding I move." She pressed her hand flat against her collarbone, the universal gesture of manufactured distress. "I feel threatened." A woman somewhere behind Evan made a small sympathetic sound, which Darla absorbed like fuel. "I'm going to need to see the gate supervisor," Darla announced to Derek, "and I'll need your employee number because I'll be making a formal complaint. My husband will be making a formal complaint. We know the regional VP of operations personally."
She said this last part slowly, letting each word land like a dropped coin on marble. Derek looked from Darla to Evan. He had done this job long enough to read a situation, and what he was reading now was producing a particular unease he couldn't fully articulate. The man in the hoodie had done nothing, said almost nothing. He was simply standing there, and something about his composure, not the composure of someone suppressing rage, but the composure of someone who genuinely had nothing to prove, was setting off a low, persistent alarm in Derek's professional instincts. "Sir," said Derek carefully, "could I see your boarding pass?" Evan handed it over without comment. Derek looked at it, then looked at Darla, then looked at the seat number printed on the bulkhead. His expression performed a series of small, controlled adjustments. "Ma'am, this passenger is ticketed for seat 2A, this seat." He extended the boarding pass back toward Evan, who took it with the same unhurried ease with which he'd handed it over. Darla's response was instantaneous. "That is impossible. I always sit here. I called ahead. There's been a mix-up." She waved her hand at Derek, a gesture that managed to be simultaneously dismissive and demanding. "Fix it." "Ma'am, I can check your boarding pass. I don't have it on me right now. It's in my bag. But I am telling you that I am supposed to be in this seat, and I am not moving until someone with actual authority comes and sorts this out." She resettled herself against the leather with the deliberate, declarative body language of a person preparing to be immovable. "And I want it on record that this man approached me in an aggressive manner and made me feel unsafe." Evan looked at Darla then. Really looked at her for the first time since he'd arrived at the row. It wasn't a hostile look. It wasn't contemptuous. It was quieter than that. A brief, thorough assessment, the kind of look that takes inventory without announcing what it's counting. Then he reached into his pocket, not for his phone, not for his boarding pass, but for nothing at all. He was simply giving her one more moment. Around them, the audience had grown. 2 passengers had their phones out, held low, angled with the unconvincing casualness of people pretending they weren't recording. A business executive in the row behind had leaned forward almost imperceptibly. Darla felt the attention like sunlight. She had always performed best under observation. She arranged her expression into something that communicated wounded dignity, brows lifted, mouth compressed, the posture of a woman unjustly burdened. She had no idea that 3 rows back, a man she'd briefly made eye contact with upon boarding was already typing a name into his phone's search engine, the name on Evan's bag tag, glimpsed in passing. She had no idea what was about to happen. She thought she was winning.
Derek had just opened his mouth to attempt another round of mediation when Evan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, a single look, 2 seconds, then returned his attention to the situation at hand. Whatever the message was, it had not changed his posture by a single degree. "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to move," Evan said. His voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than it had been before. The kind of quiet that makes people lean in to hear, which is its own form of power. Darla let out a short, incredulous laugh, the kind designed to recruit the room. "One more opportunity? Do you hear this man?" She looked at Derek. "He's threatening me now. I want him removed from this aircraft." "Ma'am," Derek said, and the slight flatness in his voice had begun to carry the weight of a man who had checked the boarding pass and knew exactly how this resolved. "I really do need you to. I know who this woman is." The voice came from the row behind, the business executive who had been leaning forward, a compact man in his 50s with the kind of expensive haircut that signals serious money. He was looking at Evan now, not at Darla. "And I know who you are, Mr. Cole." He said this with the careful neutrality of someone who understands that they are witnessing something they should not make worse. The name landed in the cabin air. Darla heard it. It didn't register immediately. Names rarely do when you're in the middle of your own performance. But in the row behind that executive, the man who had been searching on his phone found what he was looking for, and his sharp intake of breath was quiet but audible. Evan had already moved on. He looked at Darla with the same even patience, but something had shifted almost imperceptibly in the air around him. Not aggression, not triumph, but the particular energy of a man who has decided that patience has an expiration. "I'll make a call," he said, simply. He took out his phone. He did not make a show of it.
He scrolled to a contact, pressed dial, and turned slightly towards the window, the instinctive habitual privacy of someone who makes important calls in crowded places routinely. The call connected on the second ring. Marcus. A pause. Pull up the Whitmore consulting contract. Another pause, shorter. All of it. The master agreement, the amendments, and the renewal clause from October. He listened. Yeah. His voice was completely flat, completely calm, the tone of a man dictating a grocery list. Terminate it. Send the notice tonight. He listened once more. The whole thing, 500 million. Done. He ended the call. He put his phone back in his pocket. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Darla had gone very still. The performance had stopped, not wound down, but stopped, the way a record stops when someone lifts the needle mid-song. The sequins on her dress still caught the light, but she was no longer inhabiting them the same way. Something in her face had rearranged itself. "What did you just say?" Her voice had lost her performance register. What remained was smaller and uncertain. The Evan Cole Consulting Group held a $500 million contract with Cole Technology Partners. It was their primary revenue source. It represented approximately 70% of their annual operating income. It no longer does. Darla stared at him. The sunglasses were still on. Behind them, her eyes were doing frantic calculations. You don't have the authority to." She stopped. She was doing the math, and the math was turning into something she didn't want to look at directly. "I'm Evan Cole," he said, without any particular emphasis. "I'm the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of Cole Technology Partners." He glanced briefly at his boarding pass, then back at her. "And this is my seat." The executive behind him had pressed himself gently back against his headrest, the way people lean away from a controlled detonation. Derek had stopped moving entirely, standing in the aisle with the boarding pass still in his hand, understanding that his role in this particular drama had concluded several minutes ago. Darla's mouth opened, closed. The hand at her collarbone had returned, but it was no longer a performance gesture. It was the hand of a woman's chest that had tightened. "My husband," she started. "Your husband runs the firm. You should probably call him." And then, with the unhurried economy of a man who has simply been waiting for his seat, Evan reached up and opened the overhead bin. He stowed his bag with the same quiet efficiency with which he did everything. He stood aside, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the open bin, and waited for Darla to come to terms with the geography of her situation. She was still in his seat, but not for long.
For a moment, Darla Whitmore did not move. This was not defiance. The defiance had drained out of her in the 30 seconds following Evan's phone call, leaving something hollower in its place, a stunned, airless quality, like a room after all the oxygen has been consumed. She sat in seat 2A and looked at the middle distance, and the people around her watched her do it, and nobody pretended anymore that they weren't watching. Her phone rang. She looked down at the screen. The contact name was simply Richard. No last name, no nickname, no emoji. The way long marriages sometimes strip away all ornamentation. She answered it on the second ring, holding it against her ear with both hands, hunching slightly forward, in a way that had nothing to do with trying to hear and everything to do with trying to disappear. The conversation lasted 47 seconds. Those on the surrounding rows could not hear specific words, but they could hear tone, and the tone from Darla's end moved through several rooms in quick succession. Confusion, protest, a shorter protest, and then something that was not quite silence but was close to it, a listening silence, the kind where the thing being heard is not good. When she lowered her phone, her face had been reorganized by the call into something stripped of its earlier architecture. The performance persona, Darla of the stilettos and the sequins and the theatrical indignation, had packed its bags and left, and what remained was a woman in her late 40s who had just been handed a bill she hadn't known was coming. She looked up at Evan. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Evan said nothing. He was not being cruel, he simply had nothing to add. Darla began gathering herself, quite literally, retrieving the enormous handbag from the adjacent space, locating a wrap she'd draped over the headrest, picking up a small cosmetics pouch that had migrated to the armrest. Each object required locating, and each moment of locating it was a moment observed, and the observation had weight. The cabin was not mocking her, it was simply present, which was somehow worse. She stood up and the sequence caught the light again, but differently now. The dress that had seemed like armor an hour ago now looked like something from a party that had ended badly. She did not look at the executive behind her. She did not look at Derek, who had stepped back to allow her passage with the careful neutrality of a man professionally committed to not having an expression. She did not look at the passengers with their phones, or the woman who had stopped applying her lipstick, or the man who had stopped reading his newspaper and was now pretending very hard to be absorbed in his window. She looked only at the aisle ahead of her, and she walked. It was not a long walk. Business class on this aircraft was 6 rows, 12 steps perhaps, 15 from seat 2A to the curtain that separated the cabin from the rest of the plane. But the architecture of shame has nothing to do with distance. It folds and stretches according to its own logic, and those 15 steps extended themselves into something that felt much longer, under lights that felt much brighter, with an audience that felt much larger than the actual count of passengers in those rows. Her heels were loud on the floor. She had always loved that about good shoes, the authority of the sound they made, the way they announced her. Right now, the sound was just sound. She pushed through the curtain. Behind it, economy class absorbed her entrance without ceremony. She found her way to a middle seat in row 23, her actual assigned seat, as Richard had told her, because she had taken the upgrade confirmation email as an invitation rather than a notification, and had apparently misread the date, which was a mistake she was already re-architecting in her memory into something that had been someone else's fault. She sat down. The seat was narrower. The armrests were shared. The overhead light had the particular fluorescent quality of spaces not designed for comfort. She put on her seatbelt. In 2A, Evan Cole sat down, placed his boarding pass in the seat pocket, and accepted a glass of water from Derek with a brief nod of thanks. He turned to look out the window at the dark tarmac, at the ground crew in their orange vests moving with the purposeful choreography of departure preparation. He put in one earbud. He opened a document on his phone, something with dense text, numbers arranged in columns, the working material of a man who uses flight time. The door sealed, the jetway retracted, the plane began its slow, deliberate pushback from the gate. In the galley, Derek allowed himself one small private exhale. The executive in the row behind 2A caught the eye of his colleague across the aisle and exchanged a look that required no translation. 2 phones completed their uploads. One video had already received its first 17 views, time-stamped 7 minutes before takeoff, tagged with a location and a caption that read simply, "First class really said first class tonight." Darla, in 23B, stared at the headrest in front of her and tried very hard to calculate how much damage had actually been done, and whether there was a version of events she could construct by morning that would hold together under scrutiny. She did not yet know about the phones. She did not yet know about the 17 views that were becoming 60, becoming 300, becoming something else entirely. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the plane climbed into the dark, and the world below began its work without her.
The video had 60,000 views by the time the plane hit cruising altitude. Evan didn't know this. He was 35,000 feet above the ocean with his phone in airplane mode, reading a quarterly logistics report with the focused attention of a man who treats flight time as a gift. Around him, the cabin had settled into the specific hush of night travel, reclined seats, blankets pulled up, the soft glow of individual screens in the dark. He finished the report, started a second document, and somewhere around the second hour of the flight, closed his eyes. He slept. On the ground, his world did not. The first video was clean, a clear, steady shot from a seat 3 rows back, capturing Darla's performance in honest, unflattering detail. Her voice carried well. Her gestures were legible. The moment Evan said the name of the contract and the number attached to it had been captured with perfect audio. It was the kind of footage that needed no narration, no music, no editorial framing. It told its own story, and the story was simple. A woman behaved badly, and it cost her considerably. By midnight, it had 200,000 views. By 1 in the morning, it was trending. Richard Whitmore had been watching the numbers from his home office for 4 hours, his tie loosened, a glass of something he wasn't tasting on the desk beside him. He was a practical man, had been for 30 years, which is how he had built the consulting firm from a 2-person operation into something that had warranted a $500 million contract from one of the most powerful technology companies in the world. Practical men, when faced with crises, look for leverage. He found his leverage at 1:47 in the morning. It had taken a media contact, a freelance editor he'd used twice before for sensitive projects, and approximately $900 in cash transfer fees. What it produced was a second video, 40 seconds, carefully constructed. In it, Evan Cole appeared to be the aggressor. The clip used genuine footage, the same viral original, but it was trimmed with surgical precision, beginning after Darla's distress and ending before her fabrication, extracting from context every moment where Evan's stillness could be misread as menace. A caption had been added, a backing audio track, barely perceptible, that a forensic analyst would identify later, but that the human brain processed unconsciously as tension. He uploaded it from a clean account. He seeded it through 3 amplifier networks he'd cultivated over years of corporate image management. He wrote the caption himself. Who is protecting passengers from tech executives who bully women on planes? Calling for answers. Share if you care. Then he sat back and watched it move. By 3 hours in the morning, the doctored clip had 40,000 shares. By 4, it had been picked up by 2 mid-tier news aggregators, whose editorial standards were approximately equal to their ambition, which is to say, limited on both counts. By 4:30, Evan Cole's name was attached in searchable public record to the phrases intimidation, passenger complaint, and viral incident, with the doctored version appearing higher in certain search results than the original, a function of the seeding strategy, which had been designed specifically for that outcome. In London, Marcus Webb was Evan's chief of communications, and he had been asleep for approximately 90 minutes when his phone began its particular pattern of escalation alerts: 1 buzz, pause, 2 buzzes, pause, continuous. The sequence he himself had programmed to indicate a Category 2 situation, meaning not a fire, but smoke, and smoke in a high-wind environment. He sat up in the dark and began reading. By the time he'd consumed the landscape, original video, doctored video, news pickup, social spread, sentiment analysis, it was 5 minutes past 4 in the morning, and Marcus had the specific, controlled nausea of a man who has done crisis communications for 11 years and knows exactly what a well-resourced smear looks like from the inside. He tried to reach Evan. The call went to voicemail, airplane mode, obviously. They were still 6 hours from landing. He left a message that was professionally calm and substantively urgent. Then he tried the plane's satellite communication service through the airline's corporate desk, was told that the passenger had not enabled the in-flight messaging service, and hung up with the particular frustration of a man who had told his employer on multiple occasions that the satellite messaging service was worth the additional cost. He pulled his team into an emergency thread. 7 people, 3 time zones, all of them now awake and reading the same thing with the same controlled expressions. They began to work. But Richard had a 4-hour head start, and 4 hours on the internet is a geological era. The narrative had already layered itself, original fact buried under manufactured context, truth compressed beneath the weight of 40,000 shares made by people who had never seen the original footage and never would. In 2A, above the dark Atlantic, Evan Cole slept. He did not yet know his name was being quietly and methodically taken apart. He did not yet know that by the time the wheels touched the runway, there would be a version of him in circulation that he would not recognize, a version designed by a frightened man with resources and no scruples, assembled from real pieces into a false shape. He didn't know, but he would land in approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes, and then he would know everything.
The car that met Evan at the arrivals level had Marcus in it. This was not normal. Marcus operated from London's Canary Wharf office. He did not meet planes. The fact that he was sitting in the back of the car at 6:40 in the morning with a tablet open on his knee and the expression of a man who had been awake for 3 hours solving a problem told Evan everything he needed to know about the category of morning he was walking into before a single word had been exchanged. He got in. Marcus handed him the tablet without preamble. Evan read. He was thorough. He always was. He read the original thread, the doctored clip, the news pickup, the sentiment graph, a red trending visualization that his team had pulled together overnight, showing the spread and velocity of the false narrative across platforms. He read quietly, scrolling without commentary, his face doing very little. Marcus waited. He had worked for Evan for 6 years and had learned that the waiting was not dead time, it was load-bearing. Who made the second video?
Evan said, when he'd finished. "Working on it. We've got the upload account, clean creation, 3 days old, no prior activity. The upload pattern is consistent with a professional amplification network, not organic spread. Someone paid for this." Marcus paused. "Our best read is Whitmore himself, or someone acting directly for him." Evan handed the tablet back. He looked out the car window at the gray London morning, streets wet from overnight rain, the city assembling itself for the day with its customary indifference. "Where are we legally?" "The original video is completely fine for us. It's accurate, time-stamped, multiple independent sources. The doctored version is defamatory by any reasonable standard. We can pursue it. The question is how." Marcus set the tablet on the seat between them. "Option 1 is the lawyers. Injunctions, takedowns, formal defamation proceedings. Slower, cleaner, less public." He let that option sit for a moment. "Option 2 is release everything we have. Full context, complete footage, the contract termination notice with the documented execution record, and," he paused here, "the dossier." Evan turned from the window. "You found it," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Your financial compliance team found it 8 weeks ago," Marcus said carefully. "They flagged it as a potential regulatory issue and put it in a holding file pending your decision on how to proceed. The Whitmore consulting billing irregularities, the inflated invoicing, the shell company routing, the conflict of interest documentation. It's been sitting there." He looked at Evan with the expression of a man who has thought about this from multiple angles for several hours. "If Whitmore is going to fight dirty, this is your clean answer. You release the receipts. You don't manufacture anything. You don't spin anything. You just show people what's true." The car moved through morning traffic. A light turned red. They stopped. Evan watched a woman in a yellow coat cross the street ahead of them, unhurried, a coffee cup in her hand. "I want to see everything," Evan said. "The dossier, the original footage from our team's backup, the boarding documentation, the contract termination notice with the time-stamped execution record, everything. It's already compiled. How many people worked through the night on this?" 7. "Make sure they know I'm aware of it." Marcus noted this with a small nod, the way he noted all of Evan's human side instructions, with the seriousness he applied to the strategic ones, because after 6 years, he understood that for Evan they were not separate categories. "I want to review the dossier myself before anything goes out. Full review, not a summary." "Understood." "And I want independent forensic verification on the doctored clip, a media authentication firm, not our internal team. It needs to be airtight. It needs to be the kind of thing that walks into a room and ends the argument without anyone having to raise their voice." Marcus allowed himself a small, private expression of professional satisfaction. "Already requested. They can have a full analysis by 4 this afternoon." The car pulled up outside the office building. Evan didn't move immediately. He sat for a moment looking at the entrance, where 2 of his team members were visible through the glass doors, one of them on the phone, the other leaning over a laptop at the reception desk, both of them turned away, absorbed in the work. "He had a 4-hour head start," Evan said. "It was not self-pity, it was inventory, honest accounting of the landscape." "He did," Marcus agreed. "He needed it." Evan opened the car door. "Let's go." The team assembled in the 4th-floor conference room, 7 people who had been awake since before dawn, laptops open, coffee cups in various states of depletion, the specific quiet of a group that had already done their panicking and arrived on the other side of it into functional focus. They looked up when Evan came in, and something in the room's posture changed, not into relief exactly, but into a kind of recalibration. The axis of the room shifted. He sat down, pulled a laptop toward him, and opened the dossier. And then he read. For 2 hours, in a quiet room above a wet London street, Evan Cole read the evidence of what the Whitmore Consulting Group was actually doing with the money, and it was worse than the compliance team's initial flag had suggested. Shell companies in 3 jurisdictions, inflated invoicing at a rate that had cost his company millions over 4 years, a pattern of conflicts of interest that had, in 2 documented instances, compromised proprietary project data. Not just greed, active breach. He closed the laptop. Around him, 7 people waited. 5:13 in the morning, Marcus looked up. 5:13, peak engagement on the East Coast, pre-market on the financial networks, morning news cycle just beginning in Europe. Evan looked at the window, at the gray light. We release everything at 5:13 tomorrow morning.
At 5:13 in the morning, Marcus Webb sat in the darkened conference room with his hand resting on a keyboard, 7 browser tabs open in a specific sequence, and the quiet of a man about to do something precise and irreversible. The rest of the team was there, 3 of them in the room, the other 4 remote, all connected, all still. The forensic authentication report from the media firm was open on the central screen, 32 pages of technical documentation confirming with the definitive language of experts who do not use words carelessly that the second video had been digitally altered. Specific timestamps of edit points, metadata analysis, the faint fingerprint of the audio manipulation that the human ear couldn't consciously identify, but that the software could dissect down to the frame. It was the kind of document that didn't argue, it simply showed you. At 5:13, Marcus pressed the first key. What followed was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are usually described. There were no explosions, no confrontations, no voices raised. It was the release of information, executed with the same methodical care that Evan had applied to reviewing it, in the right order, to the right places, at the right time. The first release was the authentication report, distributed simultaneously to 12 journalists, not the aggregators who had carried Richard's story, but the reporters who covered financial technology and corporate governance with the rigor of people who check sources twice. It arrived in their inboxes with a subject line that read simply, Media Forensics Report, Whitmore/Cole Incident, embargoed until 5:30 a.m. for verification. The embargo gave them 17 minutes to read the technical summary, consult their own judgment, and decide whether to move. 11 of the 12 moved. The second release, at 5:16, was the original boarding documentation, Evan's ticket, the airline's passenger manifest entry, the gate scan timestamp, the flight attendant's brief written account that Derek had filed as routine incident documentation and which had been obtained through entirely standard channels. It was a small, unassailable collection of facts that made a simple point. There had never been any ambiguity about whose seat it was. The third release, at 5:20, was the contract termination notice, 1 page, dry legal language, time-stamped to 14 minutes before the plane's departure. Listed under the documented cause were 2 words that the compliance team had chosen with care: material breach. Attached to it, and this was the piece that Marcus had argued for, and that Evan had approved in the flat, considered way he approved things he had already fully decided, was a 6-page summary of the billing irregularities, the shell company structure, and the conflict of interest documentation. Not the full dossier, the summary, enough to be clear, enough to be true, precise as a key fitted to a specific lock. The fourth element was the simplest. Evan's communications team had compiled overnight a clean chronological video cut of the original incident, every angle available from the cabin footage that had been shared publicly, arranged in sequence, with no added narration, no editorial music, no text overlays beyond timestamps. It was 4 minutes and 11 seconds long, and it showed, in order, Darla arriving and occupying the seat, Evan arriving at the row, the exchange, the call, the aftermath. It showed everything her performance had been designed to obscure, and it showed it without comment, trusting the images to carry their own weight. They did. By 5:45, 3 of the financial journalists had posted their pieces, each citing the authentication report in the first paragraph. By 6 o'clock, the authentication report itself was being shared by media critics and digital forensics professionals who had read it and were offering their own commentary on the specific techniques used in the manipulation. Commentary that was technical, authoritative, and devastating in its specificity. Richard Whitmore's phone began ringing at 6:15. He was already awake, had barely slept, and he answered the first call, which was his attorney, and then did not answer the next 4, which were from numbers he didn't recognize.
The fifth was from a journalist at the Financial Times. He let it go to voicemail. He listened to the message. He set the phone face down on his desk. Then he picked it up again and called Darla. She answered on the first ring, which told him she hadn't slept either. He didn't say much, neither did she. There wasn't much useful language available for the shape of the morning they were now inside. At 6:40 in the morning, an analyst in a financial data firm noted the first significant movement in Whitmore Consulting Group's equity valuation, private company but not invisible to market-adjacent instruments, and flagged it in a note to 3 fund managers who had exposure. The note was 4 sentences long. The last sentence contained the word regulatory. In a hotel room 2 miles from the London office, Evan Cole was asleep. Marcus had told him at 4 in the morning when the preparations were complete, "Go sleep for 2 hours, you'll need them." And Evan, with the practical wisdom of a man who knows that exhaustion is its own kind of vulnerability, had gone. He slept through the 5:13 release. He slept through the first wave of journalist pickups. He slept through the financial note and the morning hits and the moment when the authentication report began to trend on its own, carried by people who were angry about something specific, not a vague cultural anger, but a focused, documented anger at the concrete mechanics of how truth had been deliberately manipulated. He slept, and his team did what they had built themselves to do, and the truth traveled at its own speed, which turned out to be considerable. When his alarm went off at 7, Marcus had already sent a message with a single line: "It's done. Come when you're ready." Evan showered. He ate a small breakfast from the hotel menu: eggs, coffee, a piece of toast, with the quiet appetite of a man whose digestion is not impaired by stress. He dressed. He checked his phone. He read the thread of morning updates from Marcus with the same thorough, unhurried attention he gave to everything. Then he put the phone in his pocket and went to meet the day.
The thing about a controlled demolition is that it looks from the outside like chaos. Richard Whitmore had spent 29 years constructing the particular architecture of his professional life, the firm's reputation, its client relationships, the careful curated image of competence and discretion that it made it worth contracting at scale. He had built it methodically, brick by brick, and he had always understood, in the abstract way that successful men understand uncomfortable things, that it could be unmade. He had simply never imagined the specific shape of the unmaking. By 9 in the morning, the authentication report had been cited in 11 separate editorial pieces across 4 countries. The forensic language was being reproduced verbatim by journalists who had learned from the report itself exactly what to look for: the edit points, the metadata signatures, the audio overlay. The piece in the Financial Times was headlined with characteristic restraint: "Manipulated footage in Whitmore-Cole dispute points to coordinated misinformation campaign." The accompanying analysis piece, which ran below it, was considerably less restrained. It named the shell companies from the compliance summary. It named the jurisdictions. It did not yet name the specific individuals who had managed the accounts, but it noted that the documentation had been referred to 2 regulatory bodies, and it gave those bodies names. The referral had been made by Evan's legal team at 7:50 in the morning. It had taken 12 minutes. At 9:30, a Whitmore Consulting Group account manager arrived at the firm's Mayfair offices to find 2 cars parked outside that were not client vehicles. The men standing near them were not reading phones or talking to each other. They were simply present in the particular way of people who have been sent somewhere to be present. She called the managing director from the pavement. The managing director called Richard. Richard called his attorney. The attorney said, "Don't say anything to anyone." Richard said, "Are they?" The attorney said, "Don't say anything to anyone." Inside the firm's offices, a senior associate was printing documents, not shredding. The digital forensics had already established the paper trail in ways that made document destruction more incriminating than useful, but printing, pulling together anything that might constitute the firm's defense. He was doing this with the focused, slightly frantic energy of someone who has understood in the last 3 hours that the situation has moved beyond the point where anyone's personal best efforts are going to change its fundamental direction. The Whitmore equity position dropped 14% in the morning's pre-market instruments. By the time the markets had formally opened and the Financial Times piece had been in circulation for 2 hours, it had dropped further. The fund managers who had received the 615 note had already communicated with their clients. 2 institutional holders of instruments connected to Whitmore's holding group began the paperwork for divestiture. Richard Whitmore watched this on a screen in his home office. He had not gone into the firm. His attorney had advised against it, and for once in his professional life, Richard was following advice he had been given rather than substituting his own judgment. He was watching numbers move on a screen, and the numbers were telling a story that he already knew but that still had the quality of something not quite real, the way a bad diagnosis feels accurate and impossible at the same time. His phone rang again.
He looked at the screen. The name was not a journalist this time. It was a man he had known for 15 years, the chairman of a trade association he sat on the board of. He didn't answer. He watched the call end. He watched the next one begin. Darla came into the room at 10:15. She was dressed, which surprised him. He'd expected her to still be in the clothes she had arrived home in at 3 in the morning, but she had changed and done her hair, and there was something in her presentation that might have been interpreted as composure, but that he recognized after 22 years as its opposite. She sat in the chair across from his desk. "Is there anything we can do?" she said. He looked at the screen. The numbers had moved again. "No," he said. Then he said, "Not from here." She sat with that. I didn't know who he was. Richard looked at her for a long moment. The answer to this, to what it changed, to what it explained, to whether it mattered, was complicated in ways that a single morning conversation could not adequately contain, so he said nothing. At 11:42, Darla called Evan Cole's office. She did not reach Evan. She reached a member of his executive team named Priya, who was professional and warm, and who listened to Darla's opening statement, which was a compressed, carefully worded appeal that clearly had been rehearsed, and then who said, with the same warmth but with perfect clarity, that Mr. Cole was occupied with other matters at present, and that any formal communications could be directed to the legal department, whose contact details Priya would be happy to provide. Darla said, Can you tell him I called? Can you tell him I'd like to speak with him personally?" Priya said, "I'll make sure he knows you reached out." Darla sat with the phone in her lap for a while after the call ended. She was in the kitchen. The house was quiet in the particular way large, expensive houses get quiet when the thing they were built to protect is no longer quite intact. She had not eaten. She had not been able to. She kept returning, in the automated loop of regret, to the seat, to the moment she had looked up at the man in the dark hoodie and made her assessment in 2 seconds flat, and decided, on no evidence but her own architecture of assumption, that he was beneath her. She thought about the sequence, the stilettos, the performance of it, the way she had turned to address the cabin like it was her stage. She thought about 47,000 people watching her do it. She did not yet have a framework for this particular form of consequence, not because she was not intelligent, but because it had never before been available to her as a real possibility. Consequences, in her experience, were negotiable. Everything had always been negotiable. That was the money for. She was learning, at 51, in a quiet kitchen, that this was not a universal law. Outside, on a street in Mayfair, the 2 cars that were not client vehicles were still parked. The men near them had not moved. The empire wasn't gone yet, but it was on fire, and the fire was made of paper. Documents and receipts and forensic reports and time-stamped evidence, and paper fires, when the documents are true, are the hardest kind to put out.
3 weeks later, Evan Cole flew home on a Tuesday. It was an early morning departure, the kind where the airport is still in its pre-dawn mode, the terminal quieter than it gets once the day builds momentum, the shops half-lit, the coffee stands just opening. He checked in without incident, moved through security with his bag and his boarding pass, found his gate, and sat in a corner chair with a coffee and an open document on his laptop. He was reading a proposal, not the kind related to litigation or crisis management or any of the legal and regulatory machinery that was still, 3 weeks on, grinding its way through the Whitmore matter with the slow institutional thoroughness that such processes require. A proposal for a new partnership, a logistics technology collaboration with a mid-sized firm he'd been considering for 8 months. The proposal was detailed and had some interesting structural problems in the revenue-sharing model that he was annotating with the focused pleasure of someone who genuinely finds this kind of problem enjoyable. His phone was in his jacket pocket. It had buzzed during the morning with various updates, a note from Marcus on the regulatory timeline, a message from his legal team about the defamation proceedings, a brief from Priya on 3 things requiring his attention before end of week. He had read these at 6 in the morning over breakfast and had not looked at the phone since. The updates were moving in the direction they needed to move. The people who needed to be doing things were doing them. He didn't need to watch. The boarding announcement came. He closed the laptop, finished the last of his coffee, and joined the small, orderly queue for the gate. The plane was full. He found his seat, window, forward cabin, stowed his bag, and sat down with the unhurried ease of someone who has done this particular thing enough times that it has become simply the beginning of a few hours of useful quiet. He had a book he had been meaning to finish, and 2 documents he planned to work through, and somewhere over the mid-Atlantic he would probably sleep for an hour, and then there would be a meal and the last of the documents, and then the descent. He put in an earbud. The man sitting next to him was reading a newspaper. On the front of the folded paper, below the crease, Evan could see a headline that contained his name and the word vindicated. He did not remark on it. The man did not notice the connection, or if he did, managed not to let on.
The regulatory proceedings were in motion and would take the time they took. 2 of the shell companies had been formally flagged by the relevant authorities. The billing irregularities had become the subject of an investigation that was, by all accounts from the people qualified to assess such things, unlikely to conclude in the Whitmore Group's favor. The defamation suit was proceeding. Richard Whitmore had made no further public statements. Darla Whitmore had made 2. One, a brief attorney-crafted post on social media that used the word regret 3 times without specifying what exactly was being regretted, and one, a short statement to a journalist that Richard's attorney had subsequently issued a correction to clarify had been made without legal authorization. None of this was something Evan needed to actively manage. It was in the hands of the people and institutions designed for it, which is where it belonged. The things he had chosen to do himself in the weeks following the release had been different in character. He had convened a review of Cole Technology Partners' third-party contracting process, not because the firm was primarily at fault, but because the Whitmore billing irregularities had existed for 4 years and had not been caught for 3 of them, and that was a process failure worth understanding and correcting. The compliance team that flagged it in the 4th year received formal recognition, and 2 members of it received promotions that had been in consideration before the incident and that he ensured were not delayed by the noise surrounding it. He had also, in a meeting that lasted 40 minutes and was not on any public calendar, spoken with a policy working group that was developing standards for financial transparency requirements in large-scale technology contracts. He did not chair the group. He was not its most prominent participant, but he attended and he contributed, and he would attend again next month. The work was slow and unglamorous and consequential in the way that slow, unglamorous work often is. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude. The fastened seatbelt sign went off. The man beside him turned a page of his newspaper. In the forward galley, a flight attendant moved through the cabin with the smooth efficiency of someone who is good at what they do, distributing drinks with a combination of speed and consideration that was its own quiet form of expertise. Evan accepted a glass of water. He thought about none of the things that happened 3 weeks ago in a way that would be visible to an observer. He was not performing peace, he was simply not inflamed. The event had been what it was. A person had behaved badly, consequences had followed, false information had been introduced, true information had been released, and the machinery of accountability was moving in the appropriate direction. He had done what needed doing, and what needed doing had not required him to be other than himself at any point in the process. This was, he had come to understand over the years, the only way he knew to operate. Not the only way, perhaps, but the only way he found sustainable. The theatrics of dominance, the performance of power, the elaborate staging of consequence that some people found necessary, he had never learned to want those things, and he thought this was probably fortunate. They were expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. He opened his book. A novel, finally, something he'd been given 6 months ago and hadn't made space for. He read the first page, then the second, and found his way into it with the ease of a man whose mind, when given permission to range freely, does so with genuine pleasure. Below him, somewhere in the blue-gray distance, the ocean moved in its ancient and indifferent way. The world was conducting its business, markets opening and closing, institutions turning slowly on their axes, people making their various choices in the full and partial knowledge available to them. The regulatory proceedings would reach their conclusions. The documentation would be filed and reviewed and acted upon. The firm that overcharged and manipulated and constructed a small targeted campaign of misinformation would face the architecture of its own choices. And somewhere, in a kitchen or an attorney's office or a quiet room in Mayfair townhouse, Darla Whitmore was learning at some slow and private pace what it means to mistake stillness for weakness in a person who has never needed to perform. The fastened seatbelt sign stayed off. The plane moved through its arc. Evan turned another page. Outside the window, the sky was the specific blue of altitude, clear and very high, and lit from a direction that made it seem like the light came from inside the air itself, rather than from anything external. He noticed it briefly, found it pleasant, read on.